I volunteered to talk about time and memory in a medieval, in really a Western European context. I can't do more than gesture at some aspects of the topic that I think might interest this group from 1,000 years of history in a very complex and dynamic region. As Merlin predicted, my presentation will support or at least be consistent with the, quote, cultural model of time that he enunciated. Because I'm an art historian, I'm used to using images as a crutch. And so I will begin under the great vault of Chartres Cathedral, otherwise known as the external symbolic storage system of Chartres, dedicated to the Virgin. Anyone who has been to Chartres will remember the famous labyrinth on the floor, usually with pilgrims walking around it, heads down in concentration. There is little evidence for and much speculation about the use of labyrinths or mazes in the medieval centuries, or about how they were understood. Without evidence, one resorts to theory, and theoretically the Chartres labyrinth and others like it are very interesting. This is, on the one hand, an image, and such related to the often small-scale labyrinth imagery that was very common in medieval culture. These are both very, very small, perhaps I've put across on the left. On the other hand, it is a spatial configuration, a setting that enables and even invites an active response. As an image, it is a sign, a symbolic representation of something else. Most often such labyrinths, which generally occur in sacred contexts, are regarded as images of pilgrimage, that is, the journey to Jerusalem or Santiago, or some other major shrine, which is in turn a symbol for the journey of the soul to God. As a setting for performances, however, the Chartres labyrinth constitutes a stage for, we can suppose, ritualized performances, which in turn were representations in that pilgrims enacted or even acted out a familiar but largely unwritten script, what Mary Carruthers in her important book on medieval memory has called an orthopraxis, that is, a performative counterpart to the notion of orthodoxy. What does this have to do with memory? Again, it's impossible to be sure. But as Michael Camille has suggested, European high medieval culture was flooded with images, at least in certain settings, in a way that has not perhaps had a parallel until the age of the internet, far more diffused. These images, often referred to in the time as the so-called Book of the Poor or illiterate, the Biblia Pauperum, were exteriorizations of narratives and concepts found in the sacred texts and in clerical discourse, though often slanted to fulfill more specific and in some sense political agendas. Though the range of media used, sculpture, stained glass, even architecture, cathedral imagery powerfully shaped the consciousness of worshippers in the process of interiorization. That's rather obvious. The crucial point is that this was done in the light of an established ars memorativa, an art of memory, which is fundamentally spatial in that it was grounded in an idea of the organization of the objects of memory. This in turn was related to the emergence in medieval intellectual circles of the idea of system. Trained memory worked by putting the things to be remembered into the places, in Latin the loci, of a larger imagined or recollected structure, and making them memorable by association with powerful or even disturbing imagery. Carruthers has even suggested that their grotesque and even scatological images, I'm not going to show you one of those, that occur in the margins of medieval manuscripts or buildings had such a function. There's an obvious drawback to such an idea. Any major cathedral was too rich and extended an environment to accommodate the more diagrammatic approach. The sheer plethora of imagery, the redundancy of medieval visual culture, would surely have produced sensory overload. The Chartres labyrinth is in contrast relatively simple, even if it's intended in some sense to puzzle those who enter it. Certainly it is unornamented, basically. And you recall that medieval people were familiar with the labyrinth as image, that is, as a specific organization of forms. Here the point was perhaps to move the worshipper mentally from a memory palace only too full of images and loci, the cathedral, to a diagrammatic configuration within which the performer would be able to and need to supply his or her own loci and images from within memory, not least through the active recollection of experiences of pilgrimage. Central further to the organization of the labyrinth is the apparent reference to or embodiment of two different conceptions of time. On the one hand, the metaphorical pilgrim enacts a journey towards a transcendent, thereby positioning him or herself in a representation of the flow of time as a linear process, a continuum, as just said, which can be at different levels, from the life of the individual human being to the providential history of the world, which moves inexorably towards the last day, the day of wrath. On the other hand, the concentric elements of the labyrinth resonate with blocks of time that return, that is, with seasonality in general. I'm not just thinking of the day or the year, but also the familiar medieval notion of circular time, that is, in terms of shapes of history that recur, which is basic to the idea of typology, a notion fundamental to medieval culture that the New Testament is prefigured in the Old, that one age is the image in some sense of a previous age. This is Jonah, who is a prefiguration of Christ. He spends 3 days in the belly of the whale. You know the rest. The typological imagination is key to understanding medieval imagery, not to speak of anti-Semitism. In the Sainte-Chapelle, built by St. Louis IX, in Paris in the mid-13th century, the history of the ancient Hebrew monarchy is clearly offered as a prefiguration of French royal history. It's the kings you can see there in the window. But circular time was also less obviously linked to a providential typology. Indeed, it might evoke the appropriation of the sacred for particularistic and far from sacred purposes. As has recently been argued, the mid-13th century marks a profound transition from religious to relatively secular intellectual frameworks under the impact especially of Aristotelian political theory. Translations of the relevant texts were commissioned by the French monarch from the scholars settled just across the river in Paris. The proto-humanistic study of classical authors contributed to a culture of the exemplum, the example, or model, the recourse to prestigious models of action and decision, which implied an expectation of the possibility of cyclical return, or indeed a renaissance, as it was later called. The contrast between conceptions of time would become a key aspect of later medieval culture. To put it crudely, the time of the church, which for the most part subsumed seasonality, contrasted with the time of the merchant, especially with, as Merlin suggested, the appearance of clocks. It's true that in monasteries and other religious establishments, this is the famous clock in Salisbury Cathedral in England, it's true that in monasteries and other religious establishments, the regulation of time was a fundamental concern. And when clocks became available, they were quickly installed and synchronized with the bells used to mark the divisions of liturgical time as well as the working day. As Carlo Cipolla argued long ago, however, the development of clockmaking was associated with the rise of a skilled urban population of craftsmen, or rather technologists. The clock became associated with character traits, in medieval terms virtues, associated with mercantile and technical culture, notably prudence and temperance. This is Giotto, of course, in Padua. European mercantile culture was organized around documents, not only ledgers and contracts, but also, and this is especially true of Florence, memory books, libri di codanza, which often have the character of chronicles and which feature various types of events and various histories of the family, of the city, of the wider Italian or even European world, or of the age sub gratia, the age of Christian grace. It might be argued that a new attention to timekeeping, even a new conception of time, emerged out of this milieu or even mentality of scribbling merchants. And as merchants took power in medieval city republics, there were important implications for civic historiography. Not only was the keeping of historical accounts a priority, in city chronicles we find also a non-linear, non-teleological, and essentially cyclical model of time, describing, for example, alternating periods of instability and stability. It's striking that some of the most important imagery of the virtues in relation to the social world is in civic settings. Florence Bell Tower, of course, is associated with a church, but it's a civic monument paid for by the city, with the representations of the crafts and professions and the virtues and above them. You probably all know the image of the city at peace in the council chamber in the city hall of Siena. This celebrates an ascendant merchant oligarchy at the same time as it creates a memory space in which the principles informing political decision-making can be rehearsed and given concrete form. the city officials were confronted with complementary mnemonic systems, scenographic, allegorical, and textual, both of which you see here. Memory becomes then, to a degree, place-connected, if not dependent. And one thinks of the notion of site of memory, lieu de mémoire, introduced by Pierre Nora in his classic discussion. For Nora, sites of memory, lieu de mémoire, are characteristic of the modern age, which in his view in turn is characterized by the disturbance of collective memory, or milieu de mémoire, as Nora puts it, in a perhaps too nostalgic evocation of pre-industrial cultures. This disturbance is arguably what we find in late medieval city republics. In 13th century Siena, however, the image of the city is a site of memory, presented as a milieu of memory, an evocation of a shared culture that the merchant oligarchy exploited and hollowed out. If we look again at the imagery on Florence Bell Tower, we can see that the more diachronic and abstract emphasis on the fall of man, which is on the right, and the penalty of labor imposed on the first humans, is subsumed within a diachronic, metonymic, and somewhat encyclopedic emphasis on the crafts and professions that gave the city its economic and cultural prominence, including the visual arts. You see sculpture on the left. On the bell tower, alternate conceptions of time coexist or rather compete, a circumstance that seems to explain the less than complete coherence of the iconography. The fluidity of the notion of time implied in this and other late medieval imagery suggests not so much that time is constructed in memory, to quote from Merlin's introductory document, but that alternate times in the plural coexist in relation to varying strategies and techniques of memorialization, some of which may be more or less locational, place-dependent. I do not dare to suggest whether this might be a generalizable condition applicable to our own society, for example. As far as late medieval civic culture was concerned, the moment was brief. Almost everywhere mercantile ascendancy and republican regimes gave way before absolutist power, which employed much more consistent and powerful rhetorics to shape collective memory, and which of course also found various ways to enforce forgetfulness. And the notion of forgetfulness brings us back with a bang to the contemporary condition. Thank you.
Questions? Well, I have a question for you. Oh, okay, go ahead.
So I'm just going to ask whether you could spell out that idea of orthopractice that you mentioned at the very beginning.
Orthopractice, Mary Cullors' idea that in general the study of medieval cultures has been too much focused on text and on the transmission of learning and of ways of regulating thought, regulating practice. She has studied, through the study of memory systems, she studied ways in which there's a performative emphasis, that people act out in different ways their understanding of their world. And the labyrinth seems to be a very good example of it, but she doesn't actually use it. So it's a much wider understanding of the way in which knowledge was transmitted. It's especially important to me, interesting to me, because we know very little about actually how architectural knowledge was transmitted. There's clearly extraordinarily sophisticated groups of designers and workmen involved, but very little evidence about how they actually worked with each other, how knowledge was transmitted, and this makes sense of the kind of the shop as a kind of almost choreographed space in which various kinds of knowledge were transmitted through action and imitation.
I have a question, and that's about your last statement, forgetfulness in the modern period. How would you conceptualize the difference between our modern concept of time and our modern representation of time and the medieval representation of time?
I don't think there's any single medieval representation of time. I think this is one of the things that's important, is that there's really this sense of competing conceptions. That certainly this linear and circular time is the most obvious contrast. But I mean, you mentioned the idea of the town clock, for example. The interesting thing about the town clock was that it was by no means an instant. It marked by no means an instant cultural caesura or moment of change. Partly because clockwork became too complicated. So the clocks were going off at all sorts of different times, and various other ways had to be found to keep time. So what you had is especially in cities, you had people working. I mean, it's not until perhaps the 17th century do you get some kind of uniformity of temporal system, a sense of time divided up in the same way. I think you had that already in the medieval monastery, actually. And what's interesting is that the introduction of clockworks. This is not the usual account, but it seems to me that ironically the introduction of clockwork had the consequence of complicating the way people felt about time.
What did you mean by modern forgetfulness?
Iraq. I mean,
Do you think it's different? I mean, do you think it's fundamentally different from the medieval time? Do we forget more? Is our sense of time more in the moment and less on a larger frame of things?
I think the notion of oblivion is a very interesting one. You know, what every culture needs to forget. Every culture finds ways to forget. Some of the most interesting work on medieval culture has to do with the way that people recovered from trauma, for example, both individual and collective trauma. What was it that enabled people to come back from quite unbelievable collective experiences? You know, how could there's one very interesting study, for example, of the death of children, the death of babies, which is such an incredibly common phenomenon in this period. What was it that allowed people to keep coming back from what to modern society? Is it completely unforgettable? You know, there's no oblivion. You know, once a child dies, that's one of the most, you know, it's obviously one of the most extraordinary, terrible things that could happen. In medieval culture, there is this sense of coming back from it. Yes.
We've had Eric Foner from Columbia, the historian, who's brought a lot of attention to Reconstruction after the Civil War.
Indeed.
And one was the reinvention or the reconstruction of Reconstruction.
Yeah.
You talked about the medieval period. Could you say a little bit of a word as an art historian about how we construct errors? Who came up with the notion of the medieval period or the Middle Ages? And how is it as we, as human beings,
Yeah.
we can construct such enormous errors? And,
Has to do with ordering time, indeed. I mean, it comes up with the notion of the Middle Age, the medievum, which is of course after the medieval period itself. And the medieval period, actually, the late medieval period, thought of itself as modern. You know, the so-called Renaissance, which is often thought as really modern, saw itself as a rejection of what was then modern, a return to, in some sense, a return to antiquity, which of course in many ways it wasn't. So the Middle Age. One way it's been looked at is a sense of distance of within time. That it was. I mean, this is. I'm not going to subscribe to this notion, but the idea that medieval people saw much more of a continuity between themselves and the ancient past. And they were certainly aware of certain kinds of disruptions and so on, destructive episodes. But it was only with the 15th and 16th centuries that you really had a conceptualization of a distance. And that's where this notion of medievum comes in, the Middle Age. It's about creating this sense of actually an obstacle in some sense to living in the past. That you must now recapture it consciously. You must remake it. You can't simply live in it. So it's much more of a constructed memory in some sense than it had been before.
Well, I think we should move on to our third speaker and thank Charles very much.